Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Australian Reptile Park. Jake here, and once again I'm back here with Hugo, our giant male Galapagos tortoise. Now these are undoubtedly one of the most popular animals that we have here at the park, and we are fortunate to have two males. We've got Hugo here, he's probably the more famous of the two, and then we do have Dippy in the enclosure next door. Now they are a fascinating species of reptile. Tortoise, they're of course a very ancient lineage of reptile. They've been around for a very, very long time, and we just so happen to be looking at the world's largest species. Now, as the name suggests, Galapagos tortoise, they are found on the Galapagos Islands, which is about 100 kilometers off the coast of Ecuador in South America. So they're found right on the other side of the world. And unfortunately, if you like your tortoises, Australia really isn't the best place to be because we do not have a single species. The tortoise, as I mentioned, is primarily found in South America. You get them in Africa and throughout much of Asia as well. But we do not have a single species here native in Australia. But however, we do have about 30 species of freshwater turtle, and we do have 7 species of sea turtle that will visit our shores every now and again as well. So we are lucky in that respect. We do have a few turtles, quite a few, but no tortoise species. Now, as you can see here, Hugo, he's chowing down into this browse that we've got here, a bit of natural browse today, and of course, a little bit of store-bought greens as well. This is a little bit of bok choy. And as you can see, he's really not too fussy. If it's green and he can get his jaws through it, he'll pretty well try and consume it. However, they are strictly herbivorous, so out in the wild, Galapagos tortoise like this would be feeding on low-lying grasses, native cactus, and occasionally they'll be extending their neck up and out and feeding on low-lying vegetation as well. Now, there's about 11 or so species of Galapagos tortoise that still occur. Unfortunately, a number of the subspecies have gone extinct. However, there's still quite a few of them. Our two here, they come or originate from the island of Isabella, which is one of the larger islands in that Galapagos archipelago. Now, a tortoise is of course a little bit different in terms of their body structure to a turtle like we have here in Australia. Firstly, you'll see these large elephant-like feet. They're very broad, very tough, and that pretty well is a dead giveaway that this species or this group of animals, the tortoises, are spending all their time moving around on the land. I like to think of tortoises as little mini four-wheel drives. They're very good at going over very rough terrain. They've got the perfect design to do that. Now, of course, they also have this very tough shell. Now, the top of the shell is what we call the carapace, and the bottom of the shell underneath is what we call the plastron. Now, I hear a lot of people ask whether a tortoise can leave the shell, and that's certainly not the case. They're not like a hermit crab. They can't come and go from the shell as they please. In fact, the vertebra and the ribs are attached to the inside of that shell, and as you can see, all this skin around the front here, if I try and turn him around, is also attached to the shell. So it just kind of grows as he does, and he's been living here for quite a long time here at the park. He's about 69 years of age. However, Galapagos tortoise like this are one of the longest lived vertebrates in existence. They could easily live in excess of 150 years, and some individuals have neared 200 years of age. So at about 69 or 70 years of age, Hugo here has still got a little bit of growing to do and a lot of living left to do. He's about 175 kilos currently, and he will likely extend over 200 kilos in weight. So they get to be a very, very large animal. And this is typically what most people think of when they picture a tortoise, but in actual fact, many of the world's tortoise species, particularly those found in Africa and Europe, they tend to actually be quite small. Some are only about the size of a football, so they do stay reasonably small, some species, and then this species and another species known as the Ardabran tortoise get reasonably large. Alright, now I think we're going to get some questions about Galapagos tortoise. They are a fascinating species, and as I mentioned, one of the most popular when people come and visit the park. And we do actually take Hugo out of his exhibit here, and we'll take him out onto the grass in the main park area for a bit of a walk around.
So one of the main questions that we've been getting over the last few weeks, and of course today as well, is we can see that Hugo has some dints and holes in his shell. Do you want to talk through that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So the shell is made of keratin, which is exactly the same thing that our fingernails and our hair are made from. So as you can imagine, just like a fingernail, it can be quite brittle, and over time it does chip away a little bit, and you may end up with a few little indents like we see here. So it's not, that he's scratched it on something and a bit of it's broken off. It's just wear and tear, simple wear and tear over time. It doesn't really bother him in any way. And he's a pretty handsome boy, I think, anyway. And he's a very healthy Galapagos tortoise.
So he seems to be chowing down on pretty much all of that browse there. Can they digest sticks, and what do we feed them other than browse at the Australian Reptile Park?
Yeah, so they've got a pretty fantastic digestive system. Of course, in the wild, they're feeding on primarily grasses, so things that are fairly simple in terms of their, nutritional value. So you want to avoid trying to feed things that are too high in nutrients. We typically will stay away from really sugary things like carrot, sweet potato, rock melon. We'll feed those more of a treat to the galaps. It's a bit like chocolate for a human. We love eating it, and they love eating those really colourful things, but it's not an everyday thing. What we're typically feeding out here at the park is a mix of store-bought greens. So you saw I had some bok choy. We'll also feed endive, and what we're trying to feed mostly is just various forms of browse. So grass that we'll cut here on site. They get hibiscus, they'll get mulberry leaves, and pretty well whatever they're trying to eat, they'll consume and digest quite easily. If they don't like something, they're not going to eat it. So if he doesn't like the sticks and can't digest the sticks, then he's not going to eat them. So I'm really not too worried about him getting into this whole bunch of browse here.
How old is the oldest one that's been known to live?
So the oldest Galapagos tortoise that we know of was a female. She actually did live here in Australia, and she got up to about 178 years of age. So that's the oldest one that I know of personally. However, there is likely wild individuals that have exceeded 200 years of age. It's pretty incredible, and a big part of the reason for that very long life is the fact that everything they do is at a very slow pace. They basically will grow and develop at a slow pace. They're only reaching sexual maturity in their 20s, so it takes quite a long time for them to really get going, and as a result, they tend to live for a very extended period of time.
You just mentioned sexual maturity. Do you want to go through their breeding habits a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So the interesting thing about tortoise is underneath the shell, I mentioned it's called a plastron. In the males, you'll see kind of like a concave, which means that the males can actually mount the females without toppling off. Pretty handy for them. And then they can mate. And like all the chelonians or your turtles, tortoises, they're going to be laying eggs. Now that female, once she's ready to lay, will dig a bit of a hole in the ground with her back feet. She'll then deposit the eggs inside, and then that's where they will incubate for the next few months. And then when they're ready to hatch out, those babies, they'll make their way out of the nest, they'll scratch themselves out, and then of course when they're small, they're very, very vulnerable. Typically they're staying fairly well hidden for the first couple of years, and then as they get a bit of size on them, they can begin to venture out and become a little more noticeable. When they're small, they want to stay hidden away because all sorts of predators, despite their tough armor-plated shell, could quite easily kill and consume a tortoise. So a lot of predators out in the wild for them. And unfortunately, a big one that we see on the Galapagos Islands is an introduced species, the rat. And of course, the rats, they would be not consuming the tortoises themselves, but destroying the eggs before they've even had a chance to hatch. So it's very unfortunate. And as I mentioned, a number of the previous subspecies are now extinct, and a few of them are in very, very low numbers.
So what do baby Galapagos tortoises look like?
They're essentially a perfect miniature of the adults. When they start out, they're only a few inches in length, about that large, and then of course they take a very long time to develop. So you would expect even a 8-10-year-old tortoise to only be about the size of maybe a dinner plate. So they take a very long time during those first few years. It's not until they really reach their 20s and 30s that they start to look like a Galapagos tortoise and they start to get a bit of size about them. They can typically be quite a bit darker than the adults as well.
Can they swim?
Tortoises can swim. I have seen quite a few videos of tortoises swimming reasonably well, but it's not what they're designed to do. Unlike a freshwater turtle like we have here in this country, which would be spending the vast majority of their time in the water, a tortoise is designed to spend their time on the land. They can enter the water if they need to, and they will of course soak in wallows and shallow pools, but they're not really designed for swimming around, although they can if they absolutely had to.
What's the differences between tortoises and turtles? Just a brief overview.
So one of the main differences, and probably the main difference, is in the structure of the feet. So if you were to look at a true turtle species, a freshwater turtle, a sea turtle, what you would notice is clawed webbed feet, or flippers in the case of sea turtles, which they will use to move around in the water. You can see on the tortoises, they have these broad elephant-like feet, which, as I mentioned, are very tough, very rugged, and enable them to move around on the land. You've got to keep in mind that Galapagos tortoises, they're found on a volcanic archipelago. They're living in a very harsh environment, lots of inclines and terrain to get around on, so they're designed to be able to traverse the land quite easily.
Do they have ears?
They do. It's not an external ear like we do, but you might be able to see this slight depression behind the eye there. That is his ear, and more so than their hearing, they're quite reliant on their sight. They've got very good eyesight and got a reasonably good sense of smell as well. So whilst it doesn't look like they have ears, they do. It's just more of an internal ear on the tortoises.
He seems to have a pretty good bite on him. Does he have teeth?
No, so they don't have any teeth. What they have is more like a serrated beak, almost like an eagle or a hawk. So they'll use that serrated beak to slice through the vegetation, and as you can see, he does it with relative ease. And you can imagine if that were your finger or another object, say a carrot, he would slice through that very, very easily. So we do have to be a little bit careful when you've got your hands in and around the head, because he could quite easily take a finger off, but all he's interested in is his greens, and as you can see, he devours those with quite some pace, faster than he does most other things.
Do you know roughly how much they'd eat a day?
Yeah, so typically they're a grazing animal. There's just like a rhino or an elephant. During the day, they're moving around and they're feeding just as they go along. And they might, over the course of the day, consume several kilos of food. Here at the park, we typically feed out between 4 and 5 kilos of food each day to our Galapagos tortoise. So it's quite a bit in comparison to most other reptiles, and that's just very simply got to do with their feeding habits in the wild. Unlike most reptiles, which would actually feed fairly infrequently, a tortoise is an animal that is going to be feeding pretty well every single day, and as a result, they tend to go through a lot more food than your average reptile in captivity.
We mentioned yesterday about how smart crocodiles are. Do tortoises have that same kind of intelligence?
It's a tricky one. Sometimes they do things that seem relatively smart, but other times they do some really dumb things. So I wouldn't call them intelligent by any means, but as I mentioned, they have very good eyesight. They can certainly see you coming from a long way away. I think they recognise individuals, certainly recognise the uniform at least. So there is some form of intelligence there. It's just very different to what we would typically associate with other animals.
Will Hugo get much bigger, and what's like the maximum size a Galapagos tortoise can get to?
Yeah, so it does depend on the locality or the island that they come from to an extent. Some subspecies are smaller than others, but this is actually one of the larger subspecies. As I mentioned, he's 175 kilos currently. We expect he would exceed 200 kilos easily, likely in the next few years, and potentially even reach weights of up around 250 kilos. That is a very, very large animal. You're getting up there in comparison with some of your crocodilians and things like that, and certainly for a tortoise, extremely large. I mentioned that our Dabron tortoise as well. They're found in a very different part of the world. They're found off the coast of East Africa, in the Seychelles, but they are still a true giant, just like the Galapagos tortoise, and they can get almost as large, not quite as large, but reasonably large as well.
So we might do one last question.
Yep.
How can you tell the difference between boys and girls?
So one of the main things you're going to look for when distinguishing between a boy and a girl is the tail. Typically the males will have a far longer tail than the female. If we head down the other end here, while his head's busy, we might be able to see the tail. It's quite cute. He has it tucked around now, but it's reasonably long, and that's just very simply used during mating, of course. That's where the cloaca is, and typically the females will have a far shorter tail. The males typically will also get larger, so there's a bit of a size difference between the two, but the main thing you want to look for is that tail. Now, I think Hugo's pretty happy. He's got a bit of browse left to go there. We might finish up here, guys, but I hope you learnt a little bit about Galapagos tortoise here this afternoon. They are one of our favourites here at the park. We can't wait to open back up, get you back visiting Hugo and all our other animals. We're going to finish on Hugo chowing down here, and we'll see you next time. Thank you, guys. Cheers.